This series is dedicated to Brother Steve Coakley.
But this evidence of a secret society. These Masons had broke away from the British on the cover, but were secretly linked to the British through secret Masonic lodges who were chartered by the British.
In this episode, we highlight the nuances of race, color, and politics, with particular reference to the state of Virginia and the code's laws and statutes from the early 1600s and the arrival of so-called Africans to Virginia to the Great Depression. We also highlight prominent so-called negroes, the societies they belong to, and their clandestine role in molding the philosophy of the Black African identity. Starting in the early colonial period, the Virginia statutes would serve as the standard for how race would be viewed for generations to come. From the earliest days of Jamestown and the Virginia Company, the English infringement into Indian territory had been expressed under the fraudulent veil of trade. Knowing this and seeing that these Europeans were not operating under the auspices of trade, but instead were looking to repossess their land through violence. Because of this, the Powhatan became hostile toward these colonists and attacked on several occasions settlements in the Tidewater, Virginia region and along the James River. To combat this, the colonists gathered their own reinforcements funded through the Crown and other principal investors in the colonies, and created militias to raid small Indian villages. Throughout the following centuries, these tribes would become enslaved to those colonists. This is the general template by which Indians became slaves, through war and repossession. In the state of Virginia, tobacco was the cash crop. Those tribes who fell in war quickly found themselves in perpetual servitude on tobacco plantations. And from these plantations was born an in-between class of mixed children. These children were able to straddle the line between identifying as white and colored. And although they could flex on them plantation niggas all day long, off plantation, they had to act humble. They had just enough nigger in them to catch the wrong group of white boys on the wrong day, at the wrong place, at the right time. And it's 12 years a slave. But in truth, this wasn't a reality. Not every so-called black person was a slave taken from Africa. This lie has been perpetuated to the public on the highest levels of blasphemous fuckery, on par with the theory of evolution, and they both go hand in hand. For it was out of Africa, for which all mankind descends, according to them, and notice they say mankind and not man. The out of Africa theory is the cornerstone of white supremacy. For the duration of this series, we've highlighted the organizations that have influenced the philosophy of identification among Negroes in America. We began by highlighting the Boule in the first episodes, and in later episodes we detailed the history of the Prince Hall Freemasons. We looked at the differences between the organizations and the types of people they allow into their groups. For the Boule, it was the upper class, educated Negro, in most cases of mixed ancestry, who could also pass for white, while the Prince Hall faction placed among its ranks more of the common man and held significant numbers of their society within the church. For example, the AME Church was founded by Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, both Freemasons. The Prince Hall Freemasons have a longer, more concrete, and substantiated history going back to the late 1700s than Sigma Pi Phi, who inaugurated its first class in 1904. This organization is more similarly modeled after prior benevolent organizations for free colored people, from the templates of the Free African Society in Philadelphia and the Brown Fellowship Society in Charleston. Membership within Prince Hall or any other Masonic lodge was not a prerequisite for membership into the Free African Society or later the Boule, although they counted plenty of Freemasons among their most prominent numbers. From the outset, these organizations often referred to themselves as African. The first Prince Hall Lodge was named African Lodge 459. One of the earliest iterations of the Boule called themselves the Free African Society, and the church called itself the African Methodist Episcopal Church. But were any of these people who represented these organizations actually African? Or had they been brainwashed by white supremacists posing as their friends? Who is this white man standing behind Marcus Garvey? For those of you who don't know, this is Walter Plecker. He's best known for being an extreme eugenicist, racist, who believed black people were inferior to whites. He especially hated Indians who had not lost their tribal identity, and those Indians who refused to be labeled black or African. Plecker hated Indians. Of course, Garvey, on the other hand, was a Pan-Africanist who promoted the idea that America was a white man's country and all so-called blacks should go back to Africa, where they're supposedly from. So even though they occupied the same space on opposite ends of the racial spectrum, their objectives ran hand in hand. This abnormal alliance between white supremacists, eugenicists, and Marcus Garvey is quite possibly the relationship that hurt Garvey's popularity among indigenous Americans the most. Many people would ask the question, why in hell would Garvey team up with these dirty-ass white boys? The answer to that question is complicated, but in actuality, quite simple. They needed each other, or at least they thought they needed each other. In 1922, Garvey met with the imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan in Atlanta, and in his thoughts, racist whites were at least more honest in their positions and their opinions than other groups of whites who were, as he called, hypocritical. Yet, in his ambition to advance his own movement, he essentially was promoting violence toward the very same so-called black people he wanted support from, thus failing to acknowledge his own hypocrisy perceived from the indigenous public. Could a Jamaican-born Negro, Marcus Garvey, channel enough riz to strike some deal with every good old redneck south of the Mason-Dixon to ensure they wouldn't perpetuate violence against blacks? Although he had some, his reach wasn't long enough, nor his peeps strong enough. But the Garveyites was something like an army, yet barely a navy. If they would have put Phyllis out to sea, they would have sank that lady. But in all fairness to Garvey, not even the Klan had that kind of reach. So their objectives intersected at Africa. Garvey never articulated any thoughts that I could find about the Indian being reclassified into the black African, or the fact that so-called black people had been inhabiting America long before colonization. Most evidence points to Garvey truly believing that every so-called black person on the continent was brought on a slave ship, which means one of two things. Either he was extremely ignorant or extremely treacherous. For all the people who had owned their land and maintained ownership for several generations, throughout colonization, the Civil War, and Reconstruction, Garvey says, "This isn't your land, this is a white man's land. And your land is in Africa. Better yet, abandon your land and take the Black Star Line to a place where we don't even have a colony or even a hotel room. But we'll figure it out when we get there. At least we'll be among Africans." As tempting as that proposal may have sounded at the time, Garvey couldn't get enough heads to pre-order the cross-continental Spirit cruise for his first trip to Africa. Pop quiz. How many times did Garvey go to Africa? The answer might surprise you. Quote, Strange Bedfellows, Eugenicists, White Supremacists, and Marcus Garvey in Virginia, 1922 through 1927. The history of Marcus Garvey has been quite contentious and has differed greatly in offering explanations for Garvey's preoccupation with racial purity and his connection with white supremacists, like the Virginia eugenicists and the Ku Klux Klan. In 1973, E. David Cronin posited that Garvey's later stress upon racial purity probably was derived from pride in his maroon heritage, as from his humiliating experience as a full-blooded black man in the Jamaican three-color caste system, in which the small mulatto group was accorded special privilege and influence by the white ruling class. Writing later, Winston James challenged the aspects of Cronin's argument. James argued that Garvey's concern with racial purity and his racial ideology was a result of his Caribbean background. Moreover, according to James, Garvey's Caribbean upbringing also contributed to Garvey's willingness to work with white organizations. James posited that the relatively low level of race consciousness, combined with a comparatively high level of education attainment and class consciousness, made it easier for Caribbeans to work with white people in racial organizations, particularly the socialist and the communist parties in the United States. We've learned a lot about that. In general, James contended that Afro-Caribbeans, in general, were clearly not as prone to view white people with the degree of distrust and suspicion than their African-American brothers and sisters. Of course, we understand why, mainly due to the social stratification of the caste system in the Caribbean versus the mainland, which, at least on the surface, was a lot more friendly to people of color. Quote, on February 1st, 1924, Madison Grant, a New York attorney and author of The Passing of the Great Race, wrote to John Powell, a Virginia concert pianist and composer, regarding the proposed Racial Integrity Act. Grant gave the legislation his unqualified endorsement. It would be living up to Virginia's great traditions if she took the lead in legislation of this character and set, once and for all, the stamp of her approval upon the importance of maintaining race purity. These race problems are thoroughly understood in the Southland, and up to now have been maintained at great cost of blood and treasure. It would, of course, be a frightful calamity, not only to the South, but to the whole nation, in fact, to civilization itself, if the struggle for the supremacy of the white race were in any degree diminished. All right, that's
for mankind. Hey, man, if we can't keep our supremacy, then, we're fucked. It is the insidious increase of mixed breed in the lower strata of society which has heretofore undermined and ruined many white civilizations. Yours truly, Madison Grant.
With the help of Grant and others, Powell was able to successfully persuade the Virginia legislature to pass the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, which prohibited any interracial marriages or interracial sexual relationships. Y'all can't even fuck with niggas.
You was a nigger.
Okay? Can't even fuck with them coloreds now. Hey, if I catch a pure white woman and I catch a pure colored,
was a true now colored, don't Mr. You
messing around, and hell, I'ma tell you this is gonna be a dead colored, and I might let the white woman live.
Yes, he was colored. He was a nigger.
Moreover, in conjunction with the Bureau of Vital Statistics, the act provided for confirmation of race for applying for a marriage or birth certificate. You couldn't even be born without a race, or you had to adhere to whatever their box of race that they wanted you to check. So you could be a pure-blooded Indian, and they would just say, you're black, colored, Afro. Pleckerhead, the state registrar of vital statistics, took great pains to enforce the act, capitalizing on the provisions of the bill that allowed local registrars to deny marriage certificates on the basis of questionable and unclear racial background. So they already had something set where a local registrar could deny marriage between people who they assumed were mixed. So it gave the registrars a lot of power in determining whose marriage could be validated, as if you really needed the government to validate your marriage. Plecker's letters to those he suspected were passing as white reveal the extent of his crusade to ensure racial purity. Shortly after this law was enacted, Pleckerhead wrote to Miss Robert H. Cheatham regarding her newly born child.
Dear Madam, we have a report of the birth of your child, July 30th, 1923, signed by Mary Gilden, midwife. She says that you are white and the father of your child is white. We have a correction to this certificate sent to us from the City Health Department in Lynchburg, in which they say the father of this child is a negro. This is to give you warning that this is a mulatto child and you cannot pass it off as white. A newly passed law by the last legislature says that if a child has one drop of negro blood in it, it cannot be counted as white. You'll have to do something about this matter and see that this child is not allowed to mix with the white children. It cannot go to white schools and can never marry a white person in Virginia. It's an awful thing. And with regards, Walter Pleckerhead.
End quote. Strange bedfellows, eugenicists, white supremacists, and Marcus Garvey in Virginia, 1922 through 1927. Quote from Virginia's First Slaves, American Indians. Quote, decades before the first documented evidence of African slavery in Virginia, Virginians referred to Indians as slaves. In the colony's Anglo-Powhatan War of 1622 and 23, official directives mandated Indian slavery. For another example, in 1626, the colonial government granted a captured Indian man to Captain William Claiborne, so Claiborne could test his newly invented restraining device that was designed to make Indians more serviceable to the colonists. Hey man, here goes an Indian. for your little torture device. Let's see if it works. We're trying to capture these Indians. In the Third Virginia Powhatan War of 1644, the colonists transported many Indian captives on a ship owned by Governor William Berkeley to be sold as slaves in England's West Indies. Just call it the fucking West Indies. In England's West Indies, like there's not other niggas colonizing the Indies. All it really needs to say is, in 1644, the colonists transported many Indian captives to the Caribbean to be sold as slaves to defray the colony wartime expenses. Hey guys, we're gonna give you these slaves for all the ammunition that you send us to fight the Indians, who you guys can do whatever with. Now that we got them, thanks for the weapons, and we'll send you a big load of Indians as repayment. Moreover, over the next 5 years, 28 Indians were specifically identified in colonial deeds and estate inventories as servants or slaves. Everett argues that 6 of these Indians were then sold at the estate sales, and that at least 6 more were unambiguously slaves delivered and sold as merchandise and bequeathed in perpetuity to estate heirs through their last wills. He notes that while 28 Indian slaves might not sound like a large number, but 28 Indian slaves actually exceeded the figure for all Africans living in Virginia at the time. 28 Indian slaves actually exceeded the figure for all Africans living in Virginia at the time. Just to make sure you understand that. And those Africans that they're saying live in Virginia were most likely not African. They were most likely taken from the Caribbean, and they were probably taken from South America or somewhere in the Americas and transported to the Caribbean, including the Carolinas, because as we can see and as we've gone over, we know their mode of operation. We know their patterns. The colonists engaged in 3 Indian wars from 1610 to 1646, in which enslavement was considered a proper punishment for captives. Virginia also exported some captive Indians, and Everett suggests that this proves that there is an existing external market for Indian slaves in other countries and the Caribbean. Of course, he claims, I also want to say this, that in addition to the Caribbean, we also can see that these Indian slaves were taken where? To Europe, specifically England, to be sold as slaves. He claims that the market to sell Indians as slaves could have added a financial incentive in addition to other motives for colonial Indian wars. Numerous Virginia Indians were enslaved and exported during the Third Anglo-Powhatan War in 1644 to 1646. Historian Jane Guild asserts that the 1655 Act also prevented colonists from treating Indian children as slaves, even if they were being held as colonial hostages. Notably, she also states that this act is the first use of the word slave in any Virginian legislation. It is interesting and illuminating that the first appearance of the word slave in a Virginian law concerned Indians. Quote, in its legislative session in October of 1670, the Virginia General Assembly addressed the status of non-Christian servants who had been imported to Virginia by sea and whether they were servants or slaves. The legislature enacted Act XII and clarified that they were slaves. They shall be slaves for their lives. Everett alleges that this act was enacted in response to questions whether Indians were slaves and because of ongoing negotiations concerning the regulation of Indian enslavement. This act authorized and encouraged the importation of servants/slaves by sea from outside of the colony of Virginia, so that Indians would become legally lifelong slaves. As might be expected, this policy greatly increased intercontinental and long-range Indian slave trading involving Virginia and the Virginians. So we can see here they're setting up the fuckery. If you arrive by sea to Virginia, then you are to be a lifelong slave. So if you were to identify with a person who arrives by sea, you would be a lifelong slave. So here, in a sense, we can see the mind games that they're playing with the terminology of slaves, Indians, and who may or may not be considered a slave. Virginian trade outside of the colony did increase, and human captives seemed to be the primary commodity imported into Virginia. In 1671, Virginians began leading trading expeditions to the tribal nations southwest of Virginia. In 1673, a Virginian established trade relations with the Cherokees southwest of Virginia. In 1674, Carolina traders from Charleston, established trade relations with the Westo Indians in that colony and became the conduit for trade between the Westo Nation and the Virginians. Arms and ammunition were delivered to the Westos in exchange for deerskins, furs, and young Indian slaves. A Virginia legislature enacted a law regarding Indian slaves as a distinct group. Thereafter, this historian asserts the legislature addressed the single slave category of negroes and other slaves in many different statutes. Another historian makes an important point about the 1682 Act. According to Professor Edmund Morgan, that act resulted in the importation to Virginia of far more Indian slaves than has usually been recognized. I want to make this clear to you. This is saying that if a slave was captured somewhere else in the Americas, for example, the Carolinas or Georgia or even New York or anywhere else, even the Caribbean, once they arrived to Virginia by sea, they were essentially slaves for life. It didn't matter where they came from. In fact, Morgan states that in just Henrico County alone, located just north of Richmond today, and in just the year 1683, 8,433 Indian children slaves aged 4 to 18 were registered at the county court. The same year, no black children were registered. 8,433 Indian children slaves aged 4 to 18 were registered at the county court. That doesn't include Indian children slaves under the age of 4 or over the age of 18. That same year, no black children were registered. This is just in Henrico County. We know for damn sure the number of slaves or quote unquote misnomered Africans arriving in Virginia was nowhere close to 8,433. We understand this. That at no point before the year 1700 did 8,000 slaves arrive in Virginia, especially 8,000 slaves aged 4 to 18. We understand that they were Indians, and we're not even counting the slaves above the age of 18. That same year, no black children were registered. End quote. Virginia's first slaves, American Indians. If Garvey told people to go to Africa knowing the whole time that black Americans were in fact indigenous to the continent, that would make him a treacherous con artist. But if he honestly believed that there were no so-called black people in America prior to anyone else, that would just make him ignorant and a product of institutionalized brainwashing, similar to all other Afro-propagandist Negro scholars at the time, like his buddy W.E.B.T. It is because of this inherent ignorance regarding the reclassification of Indians to African and the fact he was very popular among Caribbean immigrants, he was the perfect patsy for the white supremacist agenda. Garvey found favor with Virginia eugenicists John Powell, Ernest Cock, as well as Pleckerhead. These Virginia eugenicists specialized in wanting to maintain the purity of the white race, and additionally sterilized people who were considered criminal or feeble-minded, or who had some other genetic or physical characteristic considered deficient, and of course, race being listed as one of those deficient characteristics. These men essentially drafted a law and petitioned the Virginia Assembly legislative body to pass the Racial Integrity Act of 1924. This law denied indigenous Americans any tribal identity and lumped everyone into two racial categories, white and colored. As a result of this law, the Virginia Board of Vital Statistics was created and the one-drop rule was established, which basically meant that if a person has any visible trace of quote-unquote black blood, they are automatically considered colored. On the surface, many people thought this law was enacted to prevent miscegenation, aka race mixing or marriage between races. But miscegenation laws had been on the books in Virginia since the 1700s, so the objective of their plan was far more covert than its appearance on the surface. A primary objective of this law was to strip American Indians of their pre-colonial identity and to ensure that they would not claim in the future any indigenous land. They did this through the reinforcement of laws that would essentially recategorize free Indians into colored people and consequently deny any rights offered to those considered so-called Native Americans through segregation. This quote is from Charlatan Central, just giving you a little background on Pleckerhead, and we're just going to read straight from the text. Charlatan Central, quote, "In particular, Plecker resented African Americans who passed as Native Americans, and he came to firmly believe that the state's Native Americans had been mongrelized with its African American population. In fact, since shortly after the Civil War, Native Americans from all over the country had been brought to the Hampton area to be educated alongside blacks, at times intermarrying, although Hampton's Indian schools had closed down as racial discrimination against Native Americans and the eugenics movement both grew in the state. Pleckerhead refused to recognize the fact that many mixed-race Virginia Indians had maintained their culture and identity as Native Americans over the centuries despite economic assimilation. Plecker ordered state agencies to reclassify most citizens who claimed American Indian identity as colored. Once again, Plecker ordered state agencies to reclassify most citizens who claimed American Indian identity as colored, although many Virginia Native Americans continued to live in their communities and maintain their tribal practices. Church records, for instance, continued to identify them as Native Americans. Specifically, Plecker had ordered the agencies to reclassify certain families who he identified by surname because he decided they were trying to pass and evade segregation. This remained legal in the South until federal legislation overturned it in the 60s. So what he was really trying to do was not just prevent some sort of miscegenation law based off the one drop rule, one drop of Negro blood. Honestly, what he was trying to do was keep any Indian from being recognized as Native American. You weren't segregated to the colored only section, right? Because this is about segregation in the Jim Crow South. This mainly was to keep mulattoes from passing as white officially. So on the census, he made sure to classify race as either white or black, and then determine the rules by which one would be considered white or black. And any Native American with more than 1/16 of Negro blood observable is considered colored. So a person could be full-blooded Native American, 15/16 Native American, 15/16 Indian, and they would be denied because of visible Negro blood. So not only was this used to try to keep mulattoes from passing as white, but it was also used to keep so-called Negroes from passing as Indian. Because according to their law, Native Americans, as opposed to Indians, Native Americans were considered white on the census and weren't restricted to the rules of segregation. In addition, Plecker lobbied the U.S. Census Bureau to drop the category mulatto, drop it totally in 1930 and later censuses. This deprived mixed race people of recognition of their identity. And it also contributed to a binary culture of hyperdescent in which mixed race persons were often classified as part of a group with the lower social status. So once again, he was looking to elevate poor whites above the status of, let's call them well-to-do mulattoes. So the reason for this legislation is a lot deeper than what most people realize on the surface. Yes, of course, he was attempting just to create white and colored as a racial distinction. Then he was also able to separate so-called indigenous Americans from so-called Native Americans by the one-drop rule and the recognition of Negro blood, in which you couldn't be considered a Native American, someone who was also considered white, and someone not suppressed by the so-called rules of segregation. So a lot of these so-called Negroes who had Indian blood lost their cultural identity with the swipe of a pen. Conversely, a lot of so-called white, less than 1/16 so-called natives were able to fabricate an entire history. That's why the majority of people who claim Native American identity are Caucasian. Most indigenous blacks captured through colonization had long been reclassified, but not all the tribes were so disconnected from their histories. The Virginia Vital Statistics Board erased their documented connection to tribal family history with the swipe of a pen. So we can see why these Anglo-Saxon club crackers would have been drawn to Garvey. As far as they were concerned, Garvey, in a way, was already doing their bidding. The complexities of race, ethnicity, and nationality from both sides were all being boiled down to a simple lie: white and black, or more accurately, white and colored. The tribes in Virginia didn't have many options for official recourse. These legislations were being instituted on a state government level, and their objective for perpetuating such a law was to control the national perception of who was truly an American Indian, essentially solidifying in their documents who was an Indian and who was not. From this point, the only officially recognized Indians were Europeans, with no observable trace of black blood. The Racial Integrity Act of 1924 was enforced with multiple levels of trickery. In addition to denying Virginia tribal members certain rights, they also implanted codes that would allow whites to double dip two statuses, white and Native American. Sidebar, these are the pictures of Indian chiefs from the 1800s and the early 1900s. This allowed for people with 1/16th to 1/32nd to 1/64th to 1/128th Indian blood to claim Indian heritage. The so-called first families of Virginia, descended from the colonists of Jamestown, were a group of wealthy Virginians who also claimed that they were descended from Pocahontas. They were then allowed to double dip and add on Native American ancestry along with their free white status. This allowed for people with minimum less than 1/16th ancestry to claim Native American ancestry, but anyone with more, including full-blooded Indians, were denied any official connection to their tribes and were reclassified into colored on the census. The census has always been used to manipulate the identities of the public into predetermined classifications decided on by the government, and in their inbred racism toward indigenous Americans, they needed to build a wall between so-called Native Americans and the indigenous Americans to thwart any attempt by the original Indians to reclaim their lands. If all the Indians were categorized as black or African by the government, shaking those titles would be nearly impossible. But not only that, with these official titles being mandated by the government, they could now codify these false statutes into systematic education. Textbooks of the future can easily print little white lies and big black lies. And those lies must be adopted by the public school system, and the institutionalization and propagation of those lies sit at the very foundation of social advancement. You want to go to college? You'll have to memorize and rehearse these lies to the point of complete brainwash in order to be accepted into the ranks of so-called educated blacks. The systematic installment of the American indoctrination, aka education system, built a wall between those who were connected to their ancestral roots and those who were manufactured roots through the education system. This system incentivized that disconnection, handing out trinkets of social standing for any special Negro who could memorize his lines. That's why the imported, not-so-American blacks were so valuable to both sides of the white supremacist cause. Yes, white supremacy had two faces. The face of the Southern Klan crackers was obvious, but even more covert brands of white supremacy were practiced by the so-called liberal friends of the black cause. For example, the liberal Zionist Jews who founded and funded the NAACP used W.E.B. Du Bois as their token nigger figurehead, but as we know, he had no actual power and was eventually forced out by his so-called liberal friends when he started to implicate certain Jews as swindlers who had defrauded blacks in the South out of their land. This detail points to a parallel outlook between the Southern white supremacists and the Southern Jew. Both had similar objectives. It's only natural that they became tag team partners in a scheme to overthrow indigenous Americans from their ancestral homelands. The Virginia Purity Crusade, in particular, was formed to keep mulattoes from identifying as white, thus lowering the social status of all well-to-do mixed-race Virginians, while concurrently elevating the social status of poor white Virginians. Many of these mulattoes had either been listed previously as free people of color, and some on the more melanin-deficient end of the spectrum had long been passing for white. So not only did this law allow poor whites opportunities that they could not afford to buy themselves into, it also put them uppity high-yellow Negroes in check. Quote, the first act of the Virginia Slave Code, that is to say, the first act dealing directly with the status of Negroes, was passed in 1662. The wording of the act is abundant proof that those who framed it viewed slavery as a practice well established and well understood, the word slave being used without an attempt to define its significance. The idea that the act was to establish slavery or to provide institution with the legal basis seems to have been entirely absent. The sole objective was to fix a rule by which the status of mulatto children could be determined. Prior to this act, the word slave had occurred in the statutes at 3 different times. In 1655, it was enacted that if the Indians shall bring in any children as gages of their goodwill and quiet intentions to us and amity with us, the country by us, their representatives, do engage that we will not use them as slaves. This pledge to the native Indians would seem to justify the interference that some persons, if not some Indians in the colony, had been reduced to slavery. Of course they had been reduced to slavery. But we can see here that as early as 1660, they had already had laws on the books for Indians being used as slaves. If the Indians shall bring in any children as gages of their good and quiet intention to us in amity with us, the country by us, their representatives, do engage that we will not use them as slaves. If the Indians brought their children in a show of goodwill to these people, then they were allowed freedom and they would not be used as slaves. However, any hostile Indian toward the colonists would be used as slaves. This is the actual quote from John Rolfe regarding the so-called Africans. About the last of August 1619 came in a Dutch man of war that sold us 20 niggers. 20 niggers. Did it say African? It says 20 niggers from a Dutch man of war. He was probably a Dutch master, and these niggers were probably brought from the Caribbean after they had been taken from somewhere else. But are these niggers African? It should say the first niggers in America. Quote, Free Negro in Virginia. After 1782, the relative numbers of three classes of Virginia population are pretty well known. The state census, made in 1782, although not classifying free Negroes separately, bears out the estimate made by Professor Tucker that 2,800 would represent fairly accurately the number of free Negroes in Virginia at that date. These record keepers are always looking to suppress the number of free Negroes. And that's the objective of the reclassification in the paperwork, or one of the objectives of the reclassification in paperwork, to suppress the idea that these people could have possibly been here and could have only been taken from Africa. The unparalleled increase of this class, which followed the removal in 1782 of the restrictions on manumission, and also the relative number of free colored persons, slaves, and whites in Virginia from 1790 to 1860, will be seen from white persons about equal to the number of black population. In 1850, 10,450 Negroes out of a total of 54,333, that is nearly 1/5, lived in towns, while only about 1/10 of the white population lived in cities and towns. In 1860, between a fourth and a third of the whole free colored population lived in towns and cities. In some counties, a large proportion of black inhabitants were free. In Accomack County, 3,392 of the 8,000 black inhabitants were free. In James City County, 926 out of 2,764 blacks were free. In Nansemond County, there were 2,470 free Negroes and 581 slaves. Other counties in Tidewater, in which from 1/6 to 1/2 of the colored population was free, were Charles City, Fairfax, Henrico, Isle of Wight, James City, Norfolk, Northampton, Prince William, Richmond, Southampton, Warwick, and Westmoreland. The counties in the Piedmont, which had the largest free colored population relative to the slave class, were Loudoun and Goochland. In the former, 1/6 of the Negroes were free, in the latter, 1/9. So they're telling you that there were not only free Negroes in Virginia, there were large populations in counties of free Negroes that even would dwarf the slave population. What they're also telling you is that there are large populations of free Negroes in these very same early colonized areas in Virginia that are larger than the so-called slave population. So we can see here that these groups of free blacks weren't taken from Africa. These were quote-unquote Indians reclassified as free Negroes or free blacks who had in some way become friendly and or tributary to the crown, in which they were not hostile and allowed to operate freely in the state of Virginia. And this quote comes from the Free Negro in Virginia, 1619 to 1865. To understand the historical significance of a large population of 60,000 plus free blacks in the state of Virginia during the pre-Civil War colonial era completely flies in the face of everything we've been told about the history of slavery in America. There are numerous documented examples of the free black population in certain counties in Virginia vastly outnumbering the recorded slave population. But as we've been spoon-fed lies by the American education system, which tells us that all so-called blacks were slaves taken from Africa, the truth had become hidden within subversive, legalized terminology. These laws made the American Colonization Society scheme of settling blacks in Liberia an attractive offer, prompting many free and already established so-called blacks to immigrate to Monrovia for what they thought would be a better life. One of these supposed free blacks wasn't really even black at all. According to Virginia historians, he was an octoroon, only being 1/8 black. But that is twice as black as he was allowed to be in the state of Virginia to pass for white. Joseph Jenkins Roberts' mulatto privilege card had an expiration date, and although he had acquired substantial wealth before the age of 20, somehow overcoming the hardships of being a black Virginia nigger, Joseph Jenkins Roberts rolled the dice of destiny, tempted fate, and immigrated to the new startup colony in Liberia, where there was an extremely high mortality rate. Charlton's Web, quote, among the settlers that arrived in 1822 to the future Republic of Liberia were a few Freemasons hailing from Negro lodges in the United States of America that were founded by Prince Hall. I'm going to stop here. There weren't many Prince Hall lodges in the South. So these Negro lodges in the United States of America that these men that you're going to find out became members of, they weren't in the South. However, certain men are from the South. After the lapse of a period extending over 40 years, the surviving Masons, who included a number of past presidents and vice presidents of Liberia, felt that the time had arrived for the formal organization of craft masonry in Liberia. In 1867, Thomas Amos, Joseph Jenkins Roberts was from Virginia. At the time he left, there were no Masonic lodges in Virginia. So one would ask the question, what lodge made him a member if it wasn't a lodge in Virginia? Also, Beverly P. Yates, Charles S. Dunbar Sr., F. Johns, John N. Lewis, John Chivers, James C. Minor, John Says, James M. Priest, Samuel Glasgow, William S. Anderson, and Gabriel Moore assembled a convention in Monrovia, at which it was decided that Thomas Amos would spearhead the establishment of a Grand Lodge in Liberia. So most of the politicians in Liberia were Freemasons, especially the presidents, the first presidents, and possibly the subsequent presidents to follow. For example, Beverly T. Yates was the vice president, and there were other presidents of Monrovia who were also Freemasons. Subsequently, the necessary dispensation was acquired to launch Oriental Lodge No. 1 in Monrovia to enter, pass, and raise Freemasons according to the ancient customs and usages of the craft. Similar dispensations were also granted for the erection of 2 other lodges, now known as St. Paul Lodge No. 2 of the Clay Ashland settlement and St. John's Lodge No. 3, also of Monrovia. So they have multiple factions of Freemasons in Liberia, where the country has barely been established. Continuing, the Grand Lodge of Liberia was founded in 1867. By the 1970s, there were 17 subordinate lodges, and the majority of Liberia's high-ranking officials were Masons. Matters of the state were widely believed to have been decided within the lodges. Being a Mason was a veritable prerequisite for positions of political leadership in the true Whig Party. Liberia's Masons were criticized for their influence, as well as their exclusion of indigenous Liberians from their ranks. Think about the irony in that. These so-called African Americans returned to Africa only to exclude Africans from his special little European Masonic organization. That's irony. Quote, alongside the church's fraternal organizations, many of them importations from the United States or imitations of associations among the white population of America, played an important role in the maintenance of the social fabric of the society in Liberia. Among the organizations established were the Ancient and Free Accepted Masons of the Republic of Liberia, founded in 1867, and the Grand United Order of Oddfellows, founded in 1888. Membership in these organizations was an important status symbol, and their historical role in Liberian polity has yet to be adequately studied. Among the Grand Masters of Liberian Freemasonry were Presidents Joseph Jenkins Roberts, William David Coleman, Charles D.B. King, and William V.S. Tubman. End quote. Liberia, Portrait of a Failed State. Quantitative Analysis for Liberian Colonization, 1820 through 1843. Quote, the greatest number came from Virginia, North Carolina, and Maryland. Although most immigrants came from southern states, 8 northern states were also represented. Despite the lack of strong data, one might suggest that the relative strength and weakness of the individual auxiliaries was a major factor. As early as 1817, a national officer of the society, the American Colonization Society, Francis S. Key, is that the same nigga that wrote the national anthem? Okay. Francis S. Key, oh say can that nigga see, was successful in organizing an auxiliary in Maryland. He succeeded at arousing public support for colonization, which eventually turned the state into a stronghold for the movement. The actual immigration figures from the state clearly reflect the fruits of this effort. It is possible, however, to see other determinants for immigration from the particular states at certain times. Attitudes among the black population and conditions in America dominated these other factors. The legal status of the immigrants before they left America provides one effective means of exploring these determinants. The ACS, the American Colonization Society, classified immigrants as freeborn or otherwise. The otherwise classification refers to slaves that were freed for the express purpose of deportation to Liberia, and a small number of those slaves that had purchased their freedom. An interesting pattern emerges when immigration of freeborn people is compared to that of free slaves. For the first 7 years, 560 freeborn immigrants arrived in Liberia. There are no freed slaves sent during this period. From 1827 to 1833, a total of 1,249 freeborn people and 1,302 slaves immigrated. After 1834, the freed slave rate of immigration remained almost constant, but the freeborn rate dropped sharply, with only 161 people immigrating over the 9 years to 1843. I wonder why. Public attitudes, both black and white, toward the goals of the ACS played an important role in the pattern found in Figure 2. The period 1820 to 1826, when no freed slaves left for Liberia, is explicable by the development of the society as a national organization. The initial aim of the ACS was expressed by one of its founders, Robert Finley. Coupled with the early focus on free black immigration was the slow development of support from slaveholders. The years immediately after the formation of the organization were spent bringing the cause of black colonization in Africa before the public. Once slave states recognized the activities of the American Colonization Society as a possible answer to the growing black population. The only reason that the population is growing is because they're expanding into America. They're not bringing new Africans. As a matter of fact, after 1808, no new Africans came to the country. But the population continued to grow past 4 million because now they're getting into states like Georgia. They're moving into the interior of the country to where the free Indians, who are misnomered as black Africans, have been pushed. So the growing free black population is just a growing population of people who are getting displaced throughout the colonial expansion. Because remember that the United States in 1800s didn't have the same borders as it does now. They didn't have the same claimed territory. That includes the rural parts of the country that are mostly unaccounted for. Once the slave states recognized the activities of the ACS as a possible answer to the growing black population, the pattern of immigration changed. Did it now? The period from 1827 to 1833 reflects the impact of this change. The phase of involuntary immigration began in 1827. Involuntary immigration? How does that work? How does one immigrate involuntarily? You mean deportation, possibly? How does one immigrate involuntarily? The phase of involuntary immigration began in 1827 with the arrival of the brig Doris bringing slaves from North Carolina and Virginia. Provisions were made in the wills of some slave owners for the release of slaves who were then sent to Liberia. Provisions were made in the wills of some slave owners for the release of slaves who were then sent to Liberia. I want you to free my slaves, free my negroes after I die, okay? You let James, you go let him try to find his mom and his family and them, all right? He's been working for me for 50 years, so when I kick the bucket, you going to let James free. And they sent James out to fucking Africa. They sent James out to Liberia. In 1829, Francis S. Key, say, can you see us? That can't be the same nigga. In 1829, Francis S. Key was able to state that the national office in Washington was processing offers totaling 600 slaves for removal to Liberia. Whoa, that's in 1829. They are processing offers totaling 600 slaves, and that's just in North Carolina. 600 in one snatcheroo. Support for the colonization scheme also came from certain political areas, both federal and state. James Monroe favored the idea and even argued to his cabinet in 1819 that free blacks constituted
a class of very dangerous people who lived by thievery and corrupted the slaves.
Free blacks corrupted the slaves, they say.
Colonization would encourage manumission and eventually remove the entire black population of Virginia.
Now, this is James Monroe in 1819 is looking to remove the entire black population of Virginia. The state of Virginia subsequently made all freeing of slaves contingent upon immediate removal. The data shows that Virginia was the state of origin for 35.7% of all immigrants. And this is to Liberia, that is. The final period, figure 2 from 1834 to 1842, clearly shows a strikingly rapid reversal in free black immigration. From a high of 495 immigrants in 1832, the numbers fell to the point where in 1837, 39, 40, and 41, no free-born immigrants went to Liberia. Why?
Why?
While in all other years of the period, the numbers never exceeded 60. Unlike freed slaves, the majority of free blacks could either choose to leave America or remain. Therefore, changes in the rate of freeborn immigration can serve as an indicator of both black attitudes toward colonization and the conditions in America as they affected black people. And he didn't mention this, but possibly what them niggas had heard about Liberia. Because if you knew 10 niggas who went to Liberia and half of them died, hey man, how was Liberia? Well shit, half of them is dead now. Oh, for real? It doesn't bode well for future opportunities in Liberia. But I want to get back to the point of involuntary immigration. An unaccounted for number of slaves from the South were sent to Liberia. From the very outset, free blacks looked suspiciously Upon the activities of the American Colonization Society, as early as 1817, a meeting was held in Richmond where the ACS was publicly opposed. The opposition quickly spread to many northern cities, Philadelphia in particular. And we mentioned that in earlier episodes regarding James Forten and his attitude toward the Colonization Society. And this is important here. Statements made by various groups of free blacks generally expressing the attitude that, because of their ancestors, not of their own accord, were the first successful cultivators of the wilds of America. They felt themselves entitled to participate in the blessings of its luxuriant soil, which their blood and sweat had moistened. Where possible, organizations were formed to dissuade blacks from leaving the country. Most of the educated elite within the black communities remained unalterably opposed to colonization and used their position to influence the opinions of others on the subject. They rejected the idea because they believed that removing free blacks would perpetuate the slave system in America. Colonization, in their view, would raise the price of slaves as well as remove a possible ally for slaves in any rebellions. The actual black population compared to the total freeborn immigration points out the effectiveness of this and similar arguments. As of 1830, the free black population had reached a level of 319,000, while only 1,970 freeborn people immigrated to Liberia during the entire 23 years of this study. End quote. A quantitative analysis for Liberian colonization, 1820 to 1843. The idea of sending free blacks to Africa wasn't a new one. As we have already learned in previous episodes, Sierra Leone was founded under these very same pretenses 30 years prior to Liberia. Even from the time of the American Revolution in 1775, secret plans had been proposed by varying groups of so-called whites, from abolitionists to slave owners, to relocate indigenous Americans, rebranded as African slaves, to the shores of West Africa. And just like the case in Liberia 30 years later, there was an extremely high mortality rate among the black colonists who made the excursion to Sierra Leone. The first bands of black settlers to Africa either died within the first year or were either captured and killed by the indigenous Africans surrounding their settlements. Perhaps the most ironic part of this entire story is the fact that many people who immigrated to these places did so to escape slavery in America, only to end up being captured and sold as slaves in Africa. In Sierra Leone, the second large wave of settlers was comprised mostly of black loyalists. These were so-called blacks who were loyal to the British Crown during the Revolutionary War. The majority of their ranks consisted of Southern blacks who sided with the Crown under the guarantee that they would be freed after the war. But after the British lost, the only guarantee the British could make in form of freedom was either in Nova Scotia or Sierra Leone. From the end of the Revolutionary War until after the War of 1812, an unspecified number of thousands of black loyalists were shipped to the shores of Sierra Leone, while some soldiered the frigid climate of the Nova Scotian tundra, and their descendants remain there unto this day. In correspondence with documented records, the majority of the black loyalists were from the South, especially from the Carolinas and Virginia, making most of these settlers in Sierra Leone and Liberia indigenous Americans, more particularly Virginians and Carolinians. What we have here is your classic race bait and switch. If you can convince people that they were brought from another land to be enslaved, you can easily convince them, especially after a few generations of war and displacement, that their homeland is on another continent. After all, their history was destroyed, and if they were taken from their families and ancestral homelands, Africa quickly becomes a synonym for a place they were told they came from. Yet even with all of the governmental pushback to displace these people on another continent where they would supposedly have freedom when given the choice, most people, when given the option, decided to stay and tough it out in racist America because deep down they knew the whole back to Africa thing was a lie and a trick. Let's not forget that an extremely large percentage of displaced Americans died on the ship or within their first year of arrival in Africa, dying from diseases they were not biologically equipped to handle, which would seem quite odd considering they were supposed to be returning to their homeland. Shouldn't they have been immune from those diseases? Ironically, the only diseases the indigenous Americans died from in America were brought by Europeans. And although most Indians taken to Africa died within the first year, that did not stop the American Colonization Society from sending people over there. I wonder why.
Why?
When people mention Masonic conspiracies, they're usually some obscure master plan for world domination or totalitarian control over the masses. Rarely does anyone address historical conspiracy. And when someone may address the conspiracies throughout history, the influence of the Freemasons may only be a footnote. But the Grand Lodge of England, Oriental Freemasonry of France, and Prince Hall Freemasonry in the United States have been key players in the manipulation of world history. Most of the founding fathers of America were Freemasons, and they knew exactly who they were displacing to colonize North America, especially in the state of Virginia. Most of the nation's early statutes were based upon English common law, except for the ones they could use to perpetuate slavery, like Partus Sequitur Ventrum. The status of a child follows the mother, which is a Roman law, the exact opposite of English common law, which states the status of children is that of the father, pater familias, which also states that fathers were responsible for all their children, even so-called bastard children. This loophole in American usage allowed planters to father as many children as they wanted with indigenous women without claiming natural responsibility for their children, which also allowed these men to enslave their children for life. So the children were the property of their fathers, but not his legal responsibility. These were the type of games these heathens played, just like the law that stated that any captive who arrived by sea was a slave for life. The ascension of a slave only happened through their conduits of progression. First was Christianization. Any tributary captive would first have to be a Christian to even be considered for freedom. And this is documented from the earliest days of colonization. And if that slave was a good Christian, he might be elevated to a preacher. And if he was really lucky, he was recruited into Freemasonry. These early Black Masons were missionaries of Christianity to the indigenous masses, and this was the tool by which they were elevated. Freemasons are at the center of the Pan-African conspiracy to convince indigenous Blacks that they were from Africa. All of the first organizations centered around the social advancement of so-called Blacks were titled African. African Lodge 459, the Free African Society, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and the Back to Africa movement. Although there is no proof that any of these men who founded these organizations were actually African, there is definite proof that they were Freemasons.